In a previous video, you have seen how a program that wants to process some data that's saved in a spreadsheet on the hard disk first needs to read that data into memory. And in memory, then, this data is represented as a data frame. So for example, given this little two-line program here that reads in some data, we would end up with a symbol table that has two names in it, file name and emissions data. And emissions data would be associated with this data frame that is created from the data that is saved in the spreadsheet. In another video, you have then seen how to access the data in the data frame, and in particular, you have seen how we can retrieve a single row from the data frame by asking for example, row number 7. So, asking for a particular number row. In this video, we are going to look at another way of selecting certain rows from the data frame. In this case, we are not just selecting a single row, but what we are doing in this video is that we are going to look at how to select a whole subset of rows that satisfy some condition. So for example, let's assume we are working with our emissions data, which has emissions for different countries for many different years. And we want to drill down and we want to further analyze the emissions of the US over time. So really, from all the data that's in our data frame, the only rows of the data frame that we're interested in for this particular analysis are the rows which have USA as the country name, right? So we would be interested in this first row here, but then the next row has China as the country name. So for the particular analysis where we are looking just at the US emissions, we are not interested in that row. And then this last row that's shown here, we would be interested in that again. So here is how we might do that in a program. So that, if you look at the 3 lines of code here, the first 2 lines are the same as before, and then we have this 3rd line of code here, which looks quite involved. So let's break this down a little bit. So what we have is we are calling a function called getRowsByCondition. The function has 2 arguments. The first one, emissions data, so with that first piece of information that we are providing to this function is just which data frame we are trying to access. And then the second parameter that we are giving here is this more complicated expression. And that's what we're going to look at now in a bit more detail. So you can see that as part of this expression, we have a function call that you have seen before, getColumn. So that also showed up in the video that talked about how to access data in a data frame. And so what you know from that video is that what this function does is it retrieves a single column from the data frame. In order to be able to do it, what we have to do is we have to specify which data frame we are accessing, in this case emissions data, and we have to specify what the name is of the column that we are interested in. So in this case, we are interested in the country column. And so what that gives us then is a sequence of strings where each string represents a country name. So, that sequence of strings might look something like this. We have USA, then we have China, some other things. USA appears again, some other things. So it's a sequence of country names. Now, the second part of this expression is equals equals and then string USA. So this equal operator is an operator to tell the computer to check for equality. So what we are trying to say here is this first part. So whatever is the result of this function call, is that equal to the string USA? Now, we just talked about how the first part, or the result of this function call, is a sequence of strings. So if we would take this literally and we would say, well, is this sequence of country names that comes back from this function call, is that equal to the single string USA? The answer would of course be no, because one is a sequence of strings and the other one is just a single string. Most programming languages, though, that deal with data, are made for dealing with data, they're smart enough to understand that if I have a sequence of strings and I'm asking, is this equal, so is this equal to a single string, what I'm really asking for is what I'm really asking for is a comparison where we are comparing every individual item in the sequence to the string USA. So in this case, what that means is we are going through our sequence of country names taken from the column, right, the country column, and we check whether they're equal to the string USA. So we have USA, is that equal to USA? Yes, that's true. China, is that equal to USA? No, that's false, right? And then we do the same thing for all the other entries in our country column. So for each one of these entries, we get true or false. Now we can combine that with or we can sort of apply this condition to our data frame, emissions data, in the following way, by basically saying, okay, now we have these true and false values, right? We have as many true and false values as there are columns, as there are rows in this data frame, because essentially what we did is we went through the country column, and for every entry in the country column, we said, is this equal to USA? True. Is this equal to USA? False. Right? And so now what this function getRows by condition does is that it goes through and it just selects, it retrieves all the rows for which we said that this comparison here equals true. Right? So USA is equal to USA, so the condition is true, which means this row would be selected. The next row, China, does not equal USA, so the condition is false, this row would not be selected, and so on. So what that would give us is another data frame, a new data frame, but this new data frame only contains a subset of the data in the original data frame. Specifically, in this case, it contains all the rows where the country name is USA. And then with that new smaller data frame, we can then do our analysis of emissions in the US. So what we get in memory in the end looks like this. We have a symbol table. In the symbol table we have three names: file name, emissions data, US emissions. Emissions data is associated with a reference to a data frame which contains all of the data from the original spreadsheet. And US emissions is associated with a reference to another data frame, and that data frame contains only those rows where the country name is USA. Now here is another example. For this example, let's assume that we want to look at the recent developments in greenhouse gas emissions. So we can again use this function getRows by condition to extract out the rows that we are interested in. And let's assume by recent emissions we mean everything since 2010. So we want to ignore, or for this particular analysis, we want to ignore greenhouse gas emissions that happened before 2010, and we only want to look at the emissions since 2010. So the condition that we are writing here, instead of looking at the column, the country column, because which we did the last time when we selected based on country names, this time of course we have to look at a different column, and the column we are looking at is the year column, because we want to select based on the year in which the emissions happened. So then the second part of this condition expression here, we are saying that we want emissions, or we want rows where the number in this year column is greater or equal to 2010. So if we're interested only in the emissions of exactly the year 2010, we would use our equals operator here again to get only those rows where the year in that country column is exactly equal to 2010. But we are interested in all emissions since 2010. So we are interested in all rows where the year in the country column is equal to 2010 or greater than 2010. And this operator here, greater than or equal, does that for us. So in this case, what we would end up with then is a symbol table in which, again, we have three names. File name and emissions data are just as before. And then the last name, emissions since 2010, which is introduced by this third row in our program here, would be associated with a reference to a data frame, a new data frame. And this data frame would contain all the rows from the original data frame where the number in the year column is equal to 2010 or greater than 2010. And so this is how you can extract a subset of rows from a data frame to create a new, smaller data frame if what you want to do is a targeted analysis that looks at just a subset of the rows in your data frame.